Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. In this episode, we're going to talk about the biggest operational military defeat that Germany has ever suffered in its entire history. A campaign that completely destroyed an entire German army group within a matter of weeks. Despite the massive scale of the damage inflicted and the immense operational achievement it represents, this operation gets nearly no attention in the English-speaking world. I am talking, of course, about Operation Bagration, the Red Army's triumph against Army Group Center in the summer of 1944. Hi Jesse, good to be back. Another episode, looking at the Eastern Front again. And Bagration really is a fascinating one. I've done some research on that, and as I've just said, it is striking that in the English-speaking world, hardly anyone seems to have ever heard of this. Just this morning, I was talking to a British battlefield guide, and I said we're going to record this episode, and the answer was, what is that? So they haven't even heard of this. So we really need to talk about it. And we really need to shed light on this and not only scratch the surface, but look at what really happened, because it is very eye-opening. And I think the way we're going to do it is, as always, we're going to be looking at the strategic context before we then drill in and zoom in and look at what happens at the operational and the tactical level. Perhaps before we do that, well, let's have a very short excursion on the name itself, Operation Bagration. So what is that? Who is that? Why was that name chosen? Jesse, over to you.
Right. Matthias, good to see you. And thanks everybody out there for joining us again for another one of these big ticket Eastern Front topics that I find so fascinating. In particular, this one, because as you say, Matthias, it is definitely, in terms of the military history, the impact of it, it's on the level of Stalingrad. There's no question there in my mind, but completely unknown. Maybe that's because the marketing wasn't so great, because people don't know Bagration, who the original Bagration actually was. Bagration was a Georgian prince who served in the Tsar's army in the Napoleonic Wars. Pyotr Bagration was his Russified name. So quite a famous commander, quite sort of mercurial. And he ends up being killed at the big battle against Napoleon's invasion of the Russian Empire, a battle called Borodino in English, more like Borodino in Russian, kind of. But yes, so he's the inspiration, I guess, for the naming of this operation. Probably not a coincidence that Stalin is also a Georgian, just like Bagration was. And I have to say, to me, it's also a sign of the fact that the Soviet leadership is leaning on old school patriotism in general in its war effort and its sort of thinking, rather than just communist ideology. Because, of course, why would you pick a Tsarist aristocrat to name your operation after? And it's not the only time they did that, of course. They had Operation Kutuzov and many others named after Tsarist aristocrats. So that's kind of the little wrinkle, the little backstory towards the name of the operation. For those of you who don't know, after listening to the full podcast, go ahead and Google Prince Pyotr Bagration if you're a Napoleonic Wars fan. So let's now sink our teeth into the political and military situation surrounding this operation. So what is going on, Matthias, in the first half of 1944 that sets up this massive Soviet push in the summer?
Well, generally speaking, the situation is worsening, has been worsening for the Germans for some time. They've been pushed back on the Eastern Front. There are a number of offensives in late 1943 and also in early 1944, particularly in the Ukraine. also in the Leningrad area, where the siege is finally lifted. After 900 days of siege, the city is liberated by the Soviets. The Soviets are driving into Finland, and it's obvious and visible that Finland, sooner or later, as will happen at a slightly later stage, is going to drop out of the war. At the same time, there is the fighting in the Mediterranean, where the Allies are very, very slowly marching up through the Italian boot. Very heavy fighting there. And of course, there is the threat of an invasion in the West. And all this had been decided at the Tehran Agreement, at the Tehran Conference in November and December 1943, where basically the three allies agree that they're going to have a joint approach. There is going to be a landing in the West, in France, and hopefully at the same time, so the agreement says, the Soviets would launch another big offensive in the East. So basically trying to minimize the chances for the Germans to move troops along interior lines, as they have been able to do so far, which means that the Germans will no longer have the tactical, perhaps the operational superiority, even though, generally speaking, overall, they are much weaker than the Allies. In addition to that, you also have the bombing campaign, of course, which is going on. So that continues. That's what the Allies have already called the Second Front. And this is really beginning to show effect now. German industry is being hit. German cities are being hit. In the build-up to 1944, in the first few months of 1944, actually the Allies bomb France and the Low Countries more than Germany. That's all in preparation for Operation Overlord. But you can see this is causing problems for the Germans. So about 80% of the German Air Force is now deployed in the West fighting against the bombers. So all sorts of big strategic issues that you find here. And when we go back to the Eastern Front and look at the slightly more operational picture that we can find here, you can see that through these offensives that I've just mentioned, the front line has taken a very peculiar shape. And there is a bit of a bulge, or what's also become known as the Belarusian balcony on the Eastern Front, because the Soviets, having pushed back the Germans and their allies further to the south in the Ukraine, have created a bit of a bulge that sticks out, not really like a sore thumb, but it's very obvious. And of course, the Germans know this, and the Soviets know this as well. On the other hand, when you look at the Ukraine, this is now beginning to point towards, for example, Romania, towards Hungary, also towards Poland. And both the Germans and the Soviets know that this is very crucial terrain for the Germans. For example, Warsaw needs to be protected because that is the logistical hub. Should Warsaw fall sooner or later, the whole Eastern Front would be in peril because the vast majority of German war material by railway goes through Warsaw in Poland. So you can see there are all sorts of issues. And in addition to that, of course, the Germans have been suffering massive casualties in all the campaigns they're fighting, particularly on the Eastern Front. They are beginning to run out of manpower. And it's not only any manpower, it's mainly the experienced troops that are losing now. There are still 16, 17, 18-year-olds in Germany that they can and in later stages will draft, but these are no longer the battle-hardened, experienced soldiers. So the situation is dire for the Germans at that particular time. And it is pretty clear to everybody with an open and clear mind that Germany cannot win this war anymore. And yet they keep fighting.
Yeah, and on the Soviet side, things are moving in the other direction, so to speak. I mean, their war production is starting to really hit its full swing. Lend-Lease is in full swing. Lots and lots of American trucks have entered service with the Red Army, which puts it in a position to be more mobile, to engage in mobile operations, as they showed in those offensives you mentioned, mostly in Ukraine, after the Battle of Kursk. So in the last part of 1943, they're really able to push the Germans back, cross the Dnipro River in Ukraine, partly thanks to this mobility. And that's going to be part of the recipe that they're going to use again with Operation Bagration. I do think it's worth mentioning as well that the Soviets are still taking very heavy casualties, but proportionally far fewer than they were before. So their rate of loss is still very, very high and still higher than the German one, but it's much, much less than it was in 1941, 42, and even 43. I think by the end of 1943, if I remember right, the Soviets have already suffered nearly 80% of the total casualties that they're going to suffer in the entire war. So the Red Army is now able to inflict much more damage than before while taking correspondingly less damage than before. And that's a pattern that we're going to see accelerate, let's say, in Operation Bagration. They also outnumber the Germans approximately 2-1 along the entire Eastern Front and facing this Belarusian balcony salient that's sticking out. I think I want to take 30 extra seconds here to highlight the odd shape of the front that you mentioned, Matthias. You have the Germans still controlling most of what we would today call Belarus, centered on the capital city, Minsk. That's going to be a big target for the Soviets. And then as you move south, you run into the giant swampland, which makes operations, especially mobile operations with heavy tanks and things like that, very difficult. It's called the Pripyat Marshes. Any of you who play war games out there, you'll know that the Pripyat Marshes are always a riddle on the Eastern Front because they're very difficult to move through. And beneath that, you then have Ukraine, where the Soviets have a bulge that sticks out, as you mentioned, towards Poland. So from the German point of view, they're not sure where to expect the blow. It seems like in Ukraine, the Soviets might want to attack there because that's a bit of a more dangerous salient. And that is going to factor into the Soviet planning as well for the offensive.
And the other problem that you find on the German side here is that, as always, you might say, German intelligence gets it really, really wrong. So German intelligence expects an attack, as you just said, in the Ukraine area because they think this is far more dangerous. It's threatening the German lifelines. So this is where the attack is going to come in. And Fremde Heere Ost under Gehlen, who will then later on become the head of the West German Bundesnachrichtendienst, the German Foreign Secret Service, he and his Fremde Heere Ost, where they very firmly state that, well, the attack is going to come in that particular area. They're supported by a very famous field marshal, Model, who made his name as a defensive expert on the Eastern Front. At that stage in 1944, one of the most highly respected German field marshals. And he also states the attack is going to come here. Of course, he says that because he commands the army group that is facing the Soviets in the Ukraine. So of course he would say that. The German High Command, the Army High Command, first of all, follows the Gehlen approach and says, okay, that's what's going to happen. When we go into the spring of 1944, there are more stories, there is more evidence that the Soviets are building up forces, not in the south, but further to the north. And the army groups and the armies, they send these messages back to Berlin. But basically, that is completely disregarded. They say, okay, something might be happening. However, the big attack is coming in the south. This is what our intelligence network says. Well, the problem, for example, is that Gehlen and his men didn't pick up on two entire Soviet tank armies that were massing on the other side of the German front line in the area of Army Group Center. So really, really badly done on the German side. Another point that is perhaps quite interesting is when you look at the map again and you say, what does it actually mean, Army Group Center? Well, the term suggests it's the army group that sits in the center of the front line. But actually, it's not really. It's a bit further to the north. You already mentioned the marshes that sit more or less in the middle of the front line. And Army Group Center mainly sits to the north of that. So basically, it stretches from these marshes that when you draw a line further to the west, you hit Brest-Litovsk. Later on, you would hit Warsaw all the way into the Baltic states. So it's a bit further north than what the term might actually suggest. That in itself is not a problem, but sometimes it can confuse people when you talk about army groups. And we just look at what the Soviets mass on the other side, and again, we'll go into much more detail later on, and of course, the operation, the tactical stuff as well. But just to give an idea, here you've got this army group, and against this, the Soviets managed to mass a number of their fronts, and a front is relatively similar to a German army group. They're normally slightly smaller, but against this one German army group, the Soviets managed to, that's now from north to south, to mass the second Baltic front, the first Baltic front, the third Belarusian front, the second Belarusian front, and then at the very, very south, the first Belarusian front. So this is a lot of troops. These are a lot of guns and tanks. We'll go into the detail in a minute, but you can already see the Germans are on the back foot and it's not looking good for them.
It's not looking good for them no matter how you slice those numbers as well. Should we get into the numbers? I feel like this is a...
Let's go into the numbers. That's a good idea to go into numbers. Yeah.
I'm also a numbers guy. It gives us a sense of what's to come. It gives us a sense of the balance in this area. So the Soviets decide to strike against this Belarusian balcony and against Army Group Center. They want to deceive the Germans that things are going to happen in Ukraine, and that more or less works. Not just because of Soviet efforts to deceive, but I think also, as you mentioned, because of German errors in analyzing their intelligence. They, for example, have 2/3 of their armored divisions, the Germans do, facing the Soviet front line in Ukraine, where the main blow is going to come north of those marshes, right, against Army Group Center. So they're caught, so to speak, with their pants down. And they're already starting at a major disadvantage. In this area that we've outlined here for Army Group Center in Belarus, the Soviets are going to gather about 2.4 million men, about 5,000 tanks, and about 36,000 artillery pieces and mortars. Now, to oppose that, the Germans are working with much, much less. About 1.2 million men, if we're generous, about 900 tanks, that's less than a fifth, and about 9,500 mortars and guns. So that's a little bit more than a quarter. In addition to that, the Soviets are not just going to launch some sort of frontal assault. There's a lot of planning that goes into this. I know that in our popular view in the English-speaking world of the Red Army in World War II, and maybe that's also influenced by some of the news we hear out of Russian tactics in Ukraine today, that it's essentially what the Russians would call meat assaults, right? Where you're driving herds of men, numberless herds of men towards the enemy. That is not what's happening here. This is a well thought out operation. There are lots of debates between Stalin and the generals. How should we do this? How many penetrations of the German line should we go for? Should there be one main thrust? Should there be two? A big role is played in these discussions by Marshal Rokossovsky, Konstantin Rokossovsky, and he argues very strongly for two main pushes against Army Group Center with more smaller penetrations so that they can make sure to destabilize the Germans on both sides of the major rivers, and that they're going to be able to apply this doctrine that we've talked about before called deep battle, which essentially, if you'll permit me, Matthias, a very oversimplification here, a major oversimplification, it's kind of the Soviet version of Blitzkrieg, if you will. They want to break those lines at multiple places with infantry and artillery firepower. Then they want to send tanks through to operate behind enemy lines and encircle the Germans. And Minsk is the first big prize, right? So they want to be able to encircle as many parts of Army Group Center as they can, capture Minsk, and this will open up the hinterland, so to speak, where they could target the Baltic states or where they could push on west towards Warsaw and really derail the entire German position. That was my quick and dirty version of the Soviet planning. Matthias, what did I miss?
I don't think you missed anything at all, but I think it's really interesting talking about this deep battle concept a little bit more. You already mentioned the evil B word, blitzkrieg, which always make my hair stand up because, folks, we did an episode on this. Blitzkrieg as a concept never really existed in the German thinking. But when you look at what the Soviets do, it is basically blitzkrieg on steroids. So whereas the Germans think comparatively small, you might say, when you talk about this blitzkrieg idea, the Soviets really think in operational terms. So they really want to go in big, which also means they're not very fussed about initial heavy losses. The important thing for them is to break through the enemy line and then unleash the reserves, which is normally a tank army, to really just keep going and keep pushing, which is, by the way, pretty much exactly the same principle that the Red Army, the Red Army and the Soviet Red Army and the Warsaw Pact in its whole had as the operational concept during the Cold War. So it doesn't really change. Yes, of course, it gets a bit more sophisticated, but the idea is very much the same. So this is really, really fascinating, interesting, particularly when you then compare that to what happens on the German side. Because we always have this idea now, the Germans are the masters of this maneuver warfare, of blitzkrieg, whatever you want to call it. And the Soviets, they are the dumb people. They are just at the receiving end. They don't know what they're doing. By 1944, I would say these roles have been reversed. The Germans still know how to do it on paper, but they simply do not have the manpower, and in particular the equipment, mainly tanks and air force, to really conduct such operations, particularly at the operational level. And when you look at how the Germans now want to fight, it's really interesting because they've now gone back to what you might call a pre-First World War way of fighting. So they look at the map and they say, first of all, the attack is going to come in the south. That means there are not enough troops to go around. We need to start thinning out the other parts of the front and other theaters as well. Operation Heldenklau, as it's called in German. So that means heroes' robbery. So they're trying to steal the heroes from other fronts and send them down there. And it means in this case that even though the Army Group Center still looks very, very strong on paper, they still have got 34 divisions. That is still a lot compared to modern day standards. But these are now, to the very, very large degree, with one or two exceptions, understrength infantry divisions. And that means by 1944 standards, actually during the whole Second World War, that these guys march into battle or rely on horses rather than anything else. So they're not particularly mobile, they're not particularly fast. And the Germans have learned that the Soviets are getting much better at this. They're far more motorized now. You already talked about the supply that they get. So the Germans know that they might be able to outmaneuver them. Basically do a German trick on the Germans, so to speak. And that, of course, is a problem. So how do you counter this? Well, the first idea they come up with, which is presented to Hitler in 1944, is, well, you know what, we're just going to shorten the front line. So forget about all of this, the territory Minsk. We don't really need this anymore from an operational point of view. If we just withdraw and have a shortened front line, it's easier to defend and would also create reserves that we can use somewhere else as mobile divisions, corps, whatever you want to use, to counter an attack. Hitler says that's not going to happen. It's this typical stand and fight idea that he has. He is not followed by the German Field Marshal, who is commanding his army group. That's a chap called Busch, a very interesting character himself, fights in the First World War, very, very brave, is rewarded the Pour le Mérite, the highest decoration of the Prussian army in, I think, October 1918, so towards the end of the war, stays in the army, and he then becomes a very clear follower of Hitler. And there are a number of crises in the German system, the Blomberg-Fitch crisis and other things, the planning for an invasion against Czechoslovakia in 1938, so before the war breaks out, where Busch is very, very clearly on Hitler's side. And because of that, in the late 1930s, he has a stellar rise and stellar career. So he gets promoted 3 times in, I think, 3 years. The problem is, when he gets to 1944, it's very, very obvious that he's been over-promoted. He's not able to act as a good army group commander, so he simply can't do it. He goes back to Berlin, presents to Hitler the plans of his generals, say we should shorten the front line. Hitler says, not out of the question, it's not happening. He just goes back and says, the Führer ordered this, so we're going to do it. And everybody knows at this stage, well, there's a problem. Because if you get attacked, you'll not be able to conduct this mobile war. How do you counter this? With the idea of so-called feste Plätze, which is basically fortifications. The idea behind that is that a bit like a wave breaker, you have them close to the front line, most of them. So the Germans have 5 in total, and we'll return to them a little bit later on. And the idea is in each of these, you have 1 division, and the major one, you've got 3, but the other ones would have 1. And these would just get surrounded by the enemy, fix enemy troops, slow down the enemy advance, and by doing that, making it possible for the German troops to muster reserves and then launch a counterattack. Which actually, when you start thinking about this, is not as crazy as it sounds. Because it might work, because you still have the counter-attack ability within the German army from a doctrinal point and training point of view. And the Germans know that they're still pretty good at that if they've got the material. So that can work. Well, the only problem they have, and that is why in reality it doesn't work, they don't have that material anymore because that's all been given to other parts of the front line. So this really is a poor man's solution. And so they're trying to square a circle here. And what they come up with really is the worst solution of all of them. Everybody knows once the Soviets attack, they will not be able to get these troops out anymore because they're not fast enough. So you can immediately write off these divisions that you've got in these feste Plätze, in these fortifications. but then there is nothing that you can send in there to relieve them, to have a counterattack or whatever you want to do. So really, it's in the end, a very bad decision, even though the original plan of the whole thing is actually not that silly. We understand why Hitler came up with the idea, but yeah, in the great scheme of things, not very, very clever.
Yes, what works on paper, or what would have been possible in 1942, realistically, for example, is not realistic by the time we're talking about here in 1944. Before we jump into the operation itself, which begins or is planned to begin on a very historic date, by the way, we're going back to Napoleon again as well, in a way. It's supposed to start on the 22nd of June. So obviously there's a symbolism there. That's not a coincidence either. The Germans invade the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, but Napoleon also began his campaign against the Russian Empire around the same time, June 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 1812. So all sorts of little echoes, not only in the name of the operation. But one other aspect to the Soviet plan, and now that we're coming up to the start of this Bagration offensive, has to do with partisans. And this part of the world, it's as though it were created for partisan warfare. It's vast. There are forests all over the place. There are rivers all over the place. There are swamps, as we mentioned, not only the massive Pripyat marshes, but there are other smaller swamplands as well. And the Germans don't have the manpower to root out all of these partisans, be they Jewish partisans, Soviet POWs, escaped partisans, or Soviet civilians who've joined the partisans. There are all sorts of different groups and mixtures of groups. There are something on the order of 100,000 partisans operating in Army Group Center's area behind the front lines. I had the pleasure of spending about 3 weeks in Belarus in what seems like another world now, but years ago when such a thing would have been possible. And I spent them in this area around places like Babruisk, which is a major, one of those feste plätze, one of those fortified areas, places like Minsk, places like Mogilev, and even some villages as well. I went swimming in some of those rivers. And the reason I share this is because I kept thinking about this at the time. What happened here in 1944? And you can just see from the landscape how vast it is, forest after forest, that this isn't controllable by the Germans. And the Soviets know that too. And they use these partisans to help set the stage. Especially what they use the partisans for, starting from about the night of the 19th of June is when it really intensifies, is attacking German logistics, which are struggling anyway, for a variety of reasons. First of all, they don't have as much stuff as they would like to have. Second of all, they don't have enough trains that they would like to have. And you have a different railway gauge between Germany and the Soviet Union. So they're having to do all this extra work to get trains all the way deep into the Soviet Union. Plus, now you're going to have these partisans attacking the railway lines. And there are hundreds upon hundreds of partisan actions in the days and weeks leading up to the start of the offensive. The night of June 19th to 20th alone, they derail 147 trains. Now, that is a lot of stuff. That is a pretty significant activity. Often we talk about resistance in Europe. It's very politically symbolic for kind of rehabilitating the moral fabric of occupied Europe during World War II. Well, actually, mostly it didn't really have much of an impact. The same cannot be said in this case, because there were so many partisans and they carried out quite a few effective operations, not only trains, but also damaging rail lines and damaging bridges, things of that nature. So that, I think, sets the stage for the start of the big show, so to speak.
And this whole partisan thing, as you mentioned, is quite crucial. as you've just explained, quite often resistance fighting is actually not that valuable from a pure military point of view, but here it's really, really different. So in the few nights leading up to the 22nd of June, when the Soviets finally attack, the first attack comes in, the Germans managed to defuse 3,500 charges that have been planted onto railways. So that's just the ones that they managed to defuse. You already mentioned the number of trains they derail and bridges that come down and things like this. So that actually has a big impact. And there is an entire area, which is the Pripyat marshes and slightly north of it, which in German military terminology of the time became known as the Wehrmachtsloch. So that is the whole of the German armed forces, because this is an area that is absolutely not controlled by the Germans. No Germans would ever go in there because of the terrain. You already explained it, and it's far too dangerous. You would need tens of thousands of people to clear out these areas, and they simply don't have them. The only area where the partisan activity is not as successful is in the northern part of the operational zone. And this is because in 1943 and also 1944, the Germans conducted a number of anti-partisan operations. So clearing these out. So that's a bit more peaceful. The clearing operations themselves are extremely brutal. When you look at the troops used on the German side, for example, the Brigade Dirlewanger, which consists of criminals that have been taken out of prisons, a very, very infamous and awful organization, sometimes just going around and killing people. But it, in inverted commas, pacified the area. And one other thing that works slightly in the favor of the Germans is because you have all these different factions, so sometimes even the Germans are a bit confused. Who are we fighting now here? Because what you do get sometimes is Ukrainian partisans fighting with the Germans against the Soviets, or against some sort of Polish troops, or against the Belarusians. So it's very confusing. It's a very confused situation. A little bit similar to what we see being played out in the Ukraine today, and also the political debate that we see being played out in the Ukraine today. So that works a little bit in the favor of the Germans, but not enough. And the impact of the partisans here is probably the most striking that you see during the entire war, I would argue.
Well, we don't have time to go into the political situation in Ukraine today.
Next time.
But we'll save that for another podcast that I hope we never have to do. But to get back to the start of Bagration, then in June 1944, it's delayed by a day. So it starts on the 23rd of June. And then, it breaks over Army Group Center like a thunderclap. They are not ready for this. They are not able to stop this. And essentially, the Soviets use this combination of mass numbers, not in mass formation, but superior numbers, let me put it that way, superior numbers of infantry with absolute firepower superiority to break the German lines at multiple places. So the plan works. They also use air power. And I think this is also a bit of an underappreciated, including by me, underappreciated aspect of the war on the Eastern Front, especially after 1943, is that the Soviets now enjoy air superiority, essentially, in the East. The vast majority, as you mentioned, I think on the top of the show, of the Luftwaffe is in the Mediterranean and Western theaters, protecting against the Allied bombing campaign, and they're not available here. So Red Army columns moving up to the front, reserves, logistics, field hospitals, you name it, they're not in constant fear of getting blown up behind the lines because the Germans are not able to hit them there, because the Red Air Force is dominating the air. They have a particular type of airplane that's quite useful as well, called a Sturmovik, which is a ground attack aircraft. So they are able to shoot up all sorts of German positions. They find German anti-tank positions, they find a German fortification, or they find a column of Germans moving somewhere, and they basically have free reign to do what they please, these Soviet aircraft do. What all this means is that Army Group Center is shellacked from the get-go, and the Soviet mobile units and armor are able to engage in this deep battle. And it's one of the first times that this really works kind of as planned, right? Because in previous offensives, the Soviets are certainly able to beat the Germans, push them back, but it's relatively rare that they're able to, on the move, encircle large German formations, with, of course, the exception of Stalingrad. But in Stalingrad, the Germans are staying put. They're not trying to have a sort of fighting withdrawal. Now the Soviets are achieving that. They take the Fester Platz, the town of Vitebsk, on the third day. German commanders are asking to retreat. They're being refused permission. And so this is kind of that first phase. The Soviets even use, on the topic of mobility, and then I'll turn it over to you to fill in the gaps here and carry the story on, Matthias. But in terms of mobility, what's interesting is that the Soviets actually make good use of what they call cavalry mechanized groups, because you're not going to have a lot of success with vehicles, especially wheeled vehicles, in some of these swampy areas and in the Pripyat marshes, but horses can do it. And horses can use the little trails and the little village paths that are not passable by vehicles. So the cavalry mechanized group, for example, plays a significant role cutting off the retreat avenues of German troops at a town called Babruisk, which is another one of these Festeplätze. So you can see how they are kind of knifing through the Germans, and things go south extremely quickly. I mean, this becomes an absolutely critical situation within days.
Absolutely. And if you're at the receiving end as a German, probably within minutes or hours.
Yes.
Just think about the situation. If you're now a German Lancer, a German soldier sitting in your field fortification here, and you know something is coming, because these guys by that stage knew it. And then suddenly, about a day before the operation starts, the Soviet artillery opens up. And the artillery, the god of war, always a strength of the Soviets and the Russians, and they're really hitting the Germans hard here. So where they concentrate their artillery, statistically, you have up to 150 Soviet guns per kilometer of the front line. So this is a very, very high artillery density and concentration. And they are now firing at these German positions. And most of these German positions are just field positions. So they're just dugouts. They're just a duck trench. There's nothing else. The exception to that is in these fortified areas, because the German troops themselves, so i.e. a division each, were building fortified positions there, but they also used forced labor from the civilians. So these are a bit better prepared. But of course, they also get hit even worse by the Soviets now, because the Soviets know that these are very, very crucial places. That's why the Germans fortified them. And you already mentioned the important one. Say the one furthest to the north that's of interest to us is, of course, Vitebsk. You already mentioned that. That gets hit at the first day. You already mentioned the fighting. Very, very heavy fighting. The Soviets breaking into this defensive positions. The Germans actually, when this happens, are asking for the permission to withdraw. That, again, is denied. So they keep fighting. They then try to break out anyway. And this breakout force is then completely destroyed by the Soviets. And this is a story that's now constantly repeating itself. You find exactly the same at another fortified place, which the Germans thought was probably the most important one, which is Orsha, to the south of Vitebsk. This is very important. It's a bit further in from the front line, but it's very, very important because it's a railway hub. So this is very heavily defended by the Germans, again, surrounded by the Soviets relatively quickly. The Germans try to break out. They actually manage to link up with another force. They have what they call a wandering pocket. So this pocket is now trying to reach the German front line, which is in constant retreat. And it's basically, there is no front line anymore because it's completely destroyed. And in the end, most of these are also then killed, captured by the Soviets and taken out of the equation. Several soldiers, individuals make their way through. This is a huge battle over a huge area. So sometimes, if that is the right word in this context, lucky, you might lose your unit. You might find yourself alone in a deep dark wood. There's my favorite term again. And if you don't get killed, hunted down by partisans, you might perhaps be able to get back to the German lines. Some of them managed to achieve that, but that's just a few hundred, if that, not a lot. And then you've got exactly the same story again at Bobruisk. You already mentioned that, further down to the south, which is another fortified place. Why? Again, because it is at a railway line. And the moment these major fortified places are defeated, are occupied by the Soviets, there's nothing to stop the Soviet advance rolling further to the west. And the Soviets do it in a very clever way as well. So they don't launch the entire operation in one go, but it's staged. So from north to south, it goes in one day, and one day later, they attack from north to south. So very, very clever, trying to confuse the Germans. Well, they didn't really have to do that because the Germans couldn't countermeasure what they were doing anyway. But again, you can see that the Soviets have really learned the lesson of operational warfare by that stage. It's a very painful lesson, and learning lessons in war normally means you pay with blood for it. Learning a war normally means learning by dying, not learning by doing, but it's learning by dying. And as you said earlier, well, the Soviets do die, but they have learned a lesson here. And of course, the other problem that the Germans have, I keep repeating the point I already made, is of course the manpower issue. You gave the original number that the Germans have, so it still looks quite big on paper, but actually the frontline troops in the initial stage, there's always a bit of debate over these things, as always when it comes to figures, but the frontline troops, the actual fighting troops of Army Group Center, probably sit at around 450,000 men in the opening phase of the battle. That is not a lot. And then you've got the rear area where you have logistical frameworks, you need to keep that going, you protect the railway system, all these things, but the people are actually bearing the brunt of the fighting. That is not a lot, considering what they're being hit with by the Russians, or the Soviets, I should say.
And German manpower is also eroded because of the Partisan war, of course. You've got to keep all sorts of combat units running around the swamps and bogs and forests 24/7 just to keep your railways intact and to try to hunt down a partisan. So the Germans are being squeezed from every possible direction. And of course, the result is a catastrophe from the German point of view and a wild success from the Soviet point of view. The 4th and 9th armies are nearly completely destroyed within, well, less than 2 weeks. By July 4th or so, there's almost nothing left of them. Minsk is captured. The Soviets are able to capture Minsk, the capital of Belarus, on July 3rd. They trap much of the 4th Army. That's how they end up capturing tens of thousands of prisoners, who they then ship to Moscow and parade through the streets. Over 50,000 German prisoners are paraded through Moscow. Now, this is, of course, against the Geneva Convention, but the Soviets are certainly not worried about that. At that point, they're more interested in showing the population how well things are going, humiliating the defeated enemy, and sort of scoring a propaganda coup, which I suppose, to be frank, they do by marching 55,000 Germans down through Red Square in the middle of July. Now, the Germans do try to stem the bleeding a little bit. They start to release units from other places, but they still take too much time to realize that this is in fact the main assault and not the one in Ukraine, even though, as we'll see, the Soviets are planning a major offensive in Ukraine as well. They try to hold, for example, a little bit on a very famous river called the Berezina River, famous again because Napoleon suffered a terrible defeat there during his retreat. I actually swam in the Berezina River. It's a very pretty river. It was kind of cold, but I made it. But I definitely would not have wanted to be anywhere in the vicinity of it in early July 1944, because the Germans are on the run here. And the army group is essentially completely smashed by the beginning of July. The Soviets continue. They push in the northern sector as well. By mid-July, they reach the Baltic states, so they capture Vilnius, which is today the capital of Lithuania, and pre-1939 belonged to Poland. So they're already getting almost to the Baltic coast. In the center, they're advancing and they get closer and closer to Warsaw, which leads to another strange chapter of this offensive and its consequences. But I'll throw it over to you again to fill in the blanks here. I'm trying to keep us rolling with all those Soviet army fronts pushing forward. And yeah, like I say, in 3 weeks' time, I mean, we're already talking a couple of 100 kilometers that they've moved here.
There is a lot of rolling going on here, absolutely right. Very, very fast moving and rolling. Minsk, for example, is interesting, which is the prime objective, you might say, of this operation for the Soviets, because it is Minsk, it's an important city. It's, again, a logistical hub, that's always important. And when the Soviets arrive, they find all these German warehouses and stores, but there are hardly any German soldiers left, because either they fled or there weren't any. So that, again, shows you quite something about the way the Germans wanted to or could fight at that particular stage. And of course, as you said, well, panic strikes now in the German camp, and they need to have some countermeasures. What is it that you can do? How can we counteract this massive Soviet offensive when we haven't got anything left? And the first thing that they do is, it's always a great idea in war to sack the supreme commander. So that's what they do. On the 28th of June, Bush gets sacked, and Model takes over. And that is interesting in itself, because Model now takes over Army Group Center, but he also keeps his own army group. That is interesting and also important, because that means he can now start moving some of these troops and reserves that he still has. A lot of them have been given to him from Army Group Center in the first place, back up to the north. But again, it is not enough to stop the Soviet operation. He is quite clear. He says, you know what, there's nothing we can do. We have to write off all these troops that are still fighting. If there is a fortified position or fortification that's still fighting, we will not be able to get to them. So write them all off. Don't even try to get there, because it's completely illusionary. There's one relief attempt on one of these in the early days, where you have some SS police troops who are mainly conducting anti-partisan operations, and they are told to relieve one of these fortified places, and they say, well, this is ridiculous, we're not going to do this. Then they're all to do it anyway. In good SS fashion, the first thing they do then is shoot lots of civilians, because that somehow in their mind makes sense. And of course, well, they don't get there. So it all doesn't work. And Model then really basically takes a blank sheet of paper and says, okay, let's write all these guys off. There's nothing we can do. We need to establish a new defensive line. You already mentioned the Berezina, and or, if need be, further to the west. So it's really not good. And when you go back to the north, you already mentioned the Baltic states. They get very close to cutting off the German troops in these areas. They get very close to the Baltic Sea in the area of Riga. There is then later on a German counterattack called Doppelkopf, which is a German card game. That's where the name comes from. And they managed to hold open a very thin line. Till later, when you then have, it's a different operation, we're not going into detail, subsequent Soviet offensive then creates the Kurland pocket, which remains there till the end of the war. And these are the last guys on the Eastern Front to actually surrender, because they surrender after the war is officially over. But that's a very different story. So this is really difficult, and the Soviets are now pushing on. They've now seized Minsk, and they keep pushing. The Germans are really worried, because when are they going to run out of steam? They don't really have any reserves, because let's not forget, at this stage, D-Day has happened as well. So there's a big fight going on the Western Front now. Going back to this whole idea about Tehran and, well, having attacks both on the Eastern Front and the Western Front simultaneously. So there are massive problems here that the Germans are facing. And they realize that probably the next real defensive line that they will be able to establish is close to Warsaw, is somewhere on the Vistula, not further to the east. So even the Germans realize that all of this territory is now completely lost.
Yeah, and on the topic of the chaos of this retreat, one of the most fascinating films I've ever seen about the Second World War is a German film from 1990 called, in German, Mein Krieg, and in English, My Private War. And the filmmakers found 4 or 5 or 6 German veterans who'd served on the different fronts during the war. And they were all amateur filmmakers. So they all had their own little film cameras that they used to record different parts of their war experience. And it was a very interesting film about them as men in their 70s, juxtaposed with interviews, juxtaposed with the film that they took during their war service. The point of me mentioning this is because one of them was involved in this retreat. And I still remember that interview with him where he said, in all of my experience, and if I remember rightly which guy it was, he was in from 1939 to 45 and survived the war. So he saw a lot on a lot of different fronts. And I remember him saying in that interview, I never saw a retreat as chaotic, as panic-stricken, as leaderless, and as badly carried out as the retreat in the summer of 1944 in Belarus. He just said it was every man for himself, more or less, after this initial push had smashed the lines. And from his point of view as a regular soldier, there was none of this, oh, maybe we hold on the Berezina, oh, well, now we're going to have to figure, well, we should keep Vilnius if we can. And no, it was just complete and utter chaos. And that really struck me. That's one of the first times where I really got interested in this particular operation. I would also say that the pain doesn't end for the Germans there, because the Soviets then do launch an offensive in Ukraine, which then penetrates deep into Romania, Poland. It goes up to the Carpathian Mountains. Eventually, in August, it forces Romania to switch sides. We won't spend a lot of detail on that, but just to give some general context of the impact of this operation, the Soviets liberate the death camp at Majdanek, where 300,000 people were killed by the Germans and by the SS. So there's a lot going on. And of course, then there's the Warsaw situation, where the Red Army is running out of steam, but also conveniently stops once this Polish uprising in Warsaw begins, because the people rising up against the Germans are obviously not pro-Soviet, they're pro-independent Poland. And so they kind of let that Warsaw uprising just get crushed by the Germans while they sit there across the Vistula River waiting, basically, in early August.
So yes, the Warsaw story is an absolutely fascinating one. That's for another podcast, because it really is interesting what happens there.
Absolutely.
So I think we should do one on that as well. But coming back to this retreat and how awful it actually was, you already mentioned it, and you talked about this. There are, of course, interesting quotes left, right, and center. I've got one from a German soldier who belonged to a normal infantry division, and he was one of these soldiers that had been encircled. And afterwards, he, in a documentary, actually, in a German documentary, he talks about this. And he said, we were encircled, and everyone who was at the front line were constantly crying for anti-tank guns and anti-aircraft guns to the front, using the anti-aircraft guns, of course, also to knock out tanks. And those at the rear were shouting, we don't have any petrol, we don't have any ammunition. And he said, and this happened all the time. And he finishes this quote by, I hope I may say this, because it is a quote, it was all complete shit. So you can see that really sums the whole thing up quite nicely. And just think about what this means. So you've broken through, if you're Soviet, you've broken through the German lines. You basically have the Germans on the run completely. They're just trying to get away. They can't because they're slow. The Soviets are just driving over them, killing them, doing with the Germans whatever they want before they then hit this newly established defensive line. And basically, they just run out of steam. That's it. And the casualties are absolutely horrendous. And there is a very interesting piece of writing by Grossmann. He was a famous journalist, a writer. He writes a diary of his experience on the Soviet side of the Great Patriotic War. It talks about Stalingrad as well, and how he later on gets into Berlin. And here he also writes about this, and he's just following the combat troops, and he's just looking at these situations. And he says, as he's driving through one of these formerly fortified places, he says, men are walking over German corpses. Corpses, hundreds and thousands of them, pave the road, lie in ditches, under the pines, in the green barley. In some places, vehicles have to drive over the corpses so densely they lie upon the ground. A cauldron of death was boiling here, where the revenge was carried out. So that's quite a strong one. And of course, the important one was also the revenge, isn't it? Coming back to who started the war and all this, which is sometimes I think we tend to forget about as well when we concentrate only at the operational level of war and the hardship. And it's also interesting that we're trying to do exactly the opposite here, but quite often people tend to forget about the Soviet side, and we talk about the Germans the whole time. One reason for that, the German sources tend to be more reliable, but I think there are other underlying reasons as well. So we mustn't forget why this war started. I think it's quite important to remember as well.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons we don't know as much about Bagration is exactly that, because we being the English-speaking Western countries, let's say, I mean, during the Cold War, we didn't have access to the history, to the people, as much as we did to the Germans, right? Because quite a few German officers later on played a very prominent role in telling their stories, or their versions of their stories, which were not always accurate, let's say, to the Americans and to the British and to their historical sections of their militaries and so on and so forth. So we really have perceived much more of an insight into what's happening on the German side. And I think sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's also something we should question once in a while. But hopefully we're in the midst of giving you folks out there a bit more of an insight into this Soviet victory, and also from the Soviet point of view. One other element I wanted to throw into the mix that I wanted to mention earlier as well is this is one of the first times on the Eastern Front that we really see mass German surrenders of thousands and tens of thousands. Of course, there's Stalingrad, but it's a bit of an exception, right? Because there's this big encirclement and they don't really have a choice. Here, of course, there are also encirclements, but many German units fight and fight hard, and many fight to the death, of course. But there are mass surrenders without fighting to the death, without being in a completely tactically hopeless situation. And of course, that's a sign. That's a sign that the German morale is not what it once was. Of course, they're still disciplined. The institution of the Wehrmacht is still functioning. The political leadership is still in place, but there are cracks. There are cracks showing. And on the topic of the political leadership being still in place, of course, that's another wild card that's going on at this time. On the 20th of July, there's the famous assassination attempt against Hitler, and it is, of course, related to the critical situation at the front, where Germany is obviously losing, and in the minds of the would-be assassins, something has to be done. We need to take him out in order to prevent the Soviets from overrunning Germany eventually. And of course, that worked out a little bit differently. To wrap up the operational side of the story, the Soviets advance hundreds of kilometers from central Belarus, nearly to Warsaw, nearly to the Baltic Sea, and then to the Carpathian Mountains in the south once they launch the secondary offensive in Ukraine. It's perhaps the greatest Allied victory of the Second World War in the European theater, at least. And as you mentioned, perhaps the greatest defeat in Germany's military history as well. The Germans take somewhere on the order of 450 to 500,000 casualties in Operation Bagration. The Soviets take more, maybe 750 to 800,000 casualties, but that's a much, much better ratio from the Soviet point of view than other offensives had been in the previous years of the war. And they can still absorb those losses with difficulty, whereas the Germans, of course, cannot. And so that's sort of the story of Operation Bagration. Matthias, if you will, I mean, we've mentioned a few of the elements as to why it turned out the way it did, but what do you think are the sort of, summarize the key couple of factors? Why was this such an absolutely overwhelming Soviet victory?
Well, I think because war is always a two-man game, isn't it? So we need to look at both the German weaknesses and the Soviet strengths, which, again, sometimes we tend to overlook. As we've explained over the last hour or so, I think the Germans are completely on the back foot. Their operational decisions do not help based on their intelligence that they receive. So moving all the troops, and in particular the tank forces, further to the south. You have the interference by Hitler. You have an army group commander who's completely incapable of commanding an army group. So you can see at that end, it's already very, very difficult for the Germans to do anything. So the only thing they could have done probably was to avoid this battle and to withdraw. But of course, you're only buying time. So everybody knew at that stage really that Germany had lost the war. Hence, you already mentioned it, the 20th of July plot, with which they waited actually until D-Day had happened and this operation had happened, so they could turn around and show the world we only did it when it was obvious that Germany had lost the war, because they feared that otherwise they would be classed as they then were, as traitors. So on the German side, all sorts of problems that you find. And I think the other thing that we really need to stress is that the Soviets are getting much, much better at what they're doing. Their tactical improvements, so you still see these mass attacks where they simply run into the German machine gun fire, but you see less of these. So they spend now more time training their troops at the tactical level as well, trying to minimize casualties. It doesn't always work, and compared to what other armies do, it's not particularly impressive. But compared to what the Soviets did in, for example, 1941, this is a completely different show. And then, of course, you've got the operational level. And the Soviets, I would really argue, by 1944, are the masters of war at the operational level of all belligerent countries in World War II. So they are really, really good at what they're doing. So don't underestimate what the Soviets did in those days and the learning curve that they had. So it's quite an impressive one. So I think these are probably the main points that lead to the outcome, and also, of course, the casualties that you already mentioned. And again, these are such dimensions are very, very difficult to fathom, but that's the way it is. And yes, it is, when you look at the operational outcome, the strategic consequence, in particular, of course, the losses that the Germans sustain, it is the largest defeat the German military ever suffers in its entire history. It can't be stressed enough. This is really, really a big one. And the people in those days, they understood that and they knew that. They just couldn't understand what had just happened. So how could the German army, yes, it had been weakened, it was no longer in its prime, but how could such an army suffer such a drastic defeat on the hands of the Soviets? So that really sent shockwaves through the army itself. You talked about mass desertion and mass surrenders. So these are all symptoms of that realization.
Indeed, and while this is happening, of course, Hitler's telling Army Group North not to retreat because they need the Baltic to be free for U-boat training and so on. So at the strategic level, there is also a complete divorce from reality. So, folks, that was our take on Operation Bagration. I hope you've come away with it with a better appreciation for what happened there and its significance, most especially because, of course, we want to lift the lid on these aspects of the war that are not as appreciated, not as well understood as they should be in our English-speaking world that we're in. So, thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one. You've been listening to World War II: Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening.
Don't think you missed anything there, to be perfectly honest.
You're
but
too
I need
kind.
to think of, do I need to think of something now very quickly?